Good morning. We'll roll call in just a moment here. Stand by. Okay, welcome back to the continuation of Monday's Executive Committee meeting. We are here with one final order of business, which is Councillor McKean's pending motion on the overdose crisis safe supply pilot programs. I'll go to him in a moment to put that motion, because that would be the next order of business. However, I think before we get there, we have had additional registrations to speak. I don't know if anybody else has that list before them, but I'll read it in and make the motion to add these speakers. So a reminder, we had Peter Silverstone, Ewan Thompson, Christine Osarek, and Mackenzie Martineau, previously approved by motion to speak to this item today. And so we would be today adding Lorna Thomas from Mom Stop the Harm, Donald Mcpherson from Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, Chanel Twan, Hanik Virani, Alexandra Loverock from the Edmonton Regional Chapter of the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Daniel O'Brien, Natalie Reed, Elaine Hishka, Phil Burgess from Each Plus Every, Businesses for Harm Reduction and Polar Park Brewing Co. 14, Darren McGowan from Acadia Brewing Co. 15, Dave Ward from Niganan Housing Ventures, and 16, Kaylee Thomas on behalf of Joanna Wong. So I will move that we add those 12 speakers to the 4 from the other day, and just ask for the vote. Of course, I need to be in the correct meeting, which, oh, somehow magically I still am. Display, or once you've all voted?
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Hamilton.
Yes, Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Councillor Walters. And we're just missing. Thank you, Councillor Cartmel. We have 5 votes, Mr. Mayor.
Display the vote. Carried, and that will serve as a roll call as well. I suppose I should have roll called at the beginning, but everybody from the committee is on deck. I note we're joined, at least those I can see on the screen, by Councillor Ben Henderson and Councillor Mo Banga. Any other members of council joining us this morning? No? Well, welcome to you both, in addition to the committee members and those members of the public who've joined us here today. The way this will work is some of you have presented before. You'll each have 5 minutes to make your comments to committee here today. We'll go one at a time. We'll ask you, and I'll roll call you in a moment here to make sure that we can hear you once we get Councillor McKean's motion and introductory comments on the floor. So he'll have the opportunity to make the motion and introduce the motion. Then we'll hear from each of you. Then there will be questions of you. Please keep your microphone muted except when you're speaking or when a question is specifically directed to you, just to maintain kind of basic order on the virtual Meet here. In addition, there is a chat function in Google Meet, but we would ask you all to refrain from using it because it can create issues of decorum, issues of fairness, and it can also interfere technically with the live stream. So the primary way that we will hear from you is through your comments. If you have presentations to make with slides, please make sure those have been shared with the city clerks, because we'll do this screen sharing from here and advance the slides for you. So if you do have presentations that you haven't already shared with us, and thank you if you have already, please contact city.clerk@edmonton.ca. You can also reach out through that contact information and what was provided to you in your speaker registration if you're having any technical issues whatsoever. And then once we've finished hearing from speakers and asking questions of you, then we'll ask you all to mute, and you can stay on the call to observe, but your time for a commentary will be over, and at that point we'll have questions of city administration and then potentially debate. Now, depending on how far we get hearing from speakers, and there may or may not be opportunity to go too deep on questions of administration or debate today. So we may have to figure out when that's going to continue, because we're only scheduled until noon, which should be enough time to hear from everybody this morning. I just don't know how much further we'll get beyond that. So we'll keep you posted. We'll try to solve that problem together. We have a variety of options. I'll work with Councillor McKean on that offline and with the clerks. But without further ado, in the interest of our making best use of our limited time here, I'm just going to quickly roll call and make sure that we have our speakers online and can hear you clearly. So Peter Silverstone.
Present.
Good morning. Ewan Thompson.
Present, thank you.
Good morning. Christine Ozarek. Please correct my pronunciation.
Present.
Good morning. Mackenzie Martineau.
Present.
Welcome. Lorna Thomas.
Present.
Good morning. Donald Mcpherson.
Present.
Welcome. Chanel Chouan.
Present.
Good morning. Hakik Varani.
Present.
Welcome. Alexandra Loverock.
Present.
Good morning. Daniel O'Brien.
Present, thank you.
Good morning. Natalie Reed.
Present, thank you.
Welcome. Elaine Hishka.
Present. Thanks.
Welcome. Phil Burgess.
Present.
Welcome. Darren McGowan.
Present.
Welcome. Dave Ward.
Present.
Tanse.
Nando.
And Nahiguo. And next is Kaylee Thomas.
Good morning, present.
Great, that's everybody. So we can hear you loud and clear. Again, please mute yourselves until it's your turn. Before we come to you, though, I will now go to Councillor McKean to make your motion and introduce it.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. And to complicate things a bit, I have a couple of amendments and an additional bullet point that I will introduce now to committee and our speakers.
Yeah,
First of all,
and if it's generally consistent with the intent of the previous notice, that's okay. You can make it, and if there's an objection from other members of committee, then we'll hear that. But understanding that you've made some adjustments since giving the original notice, thank you for flagging that. Go ahead and move your revised wording.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the second bullet point.
Actually, if you can read the whole motion in.
Okay, sure, sorry. Just to get to the right. So that executive committee recommend to City Council that the mayor on behalf of City Council write a letter to the Prime Minister asking the following. Number one, that the federal government officially recognize the overdose crisis as a national public health emergency. I got to get to my, and number two, this is the amended one, that the federal government fund and accommodate overdose prevention programs in Edmonton utilizing pharmaceutical alternatives to illegal street drugs. Number three, that the principles of decriminalization within the Government of Canada's proposed amendments to the Canadian Drug and Substances Act, as proposed in Bill C-22, be enacted by Parliament. And I have a fourth bullet, which would read that administration engage with the Government of Alberta in regards to Edmonton's 5 supportive housing sites to determine their eligibility for designation as therapeutic communities with addiction treatment that includes pharmaceutical alternatives to illegal street drugs. Mr. Mayor, may I introduce that now?
I'll just double check that there are no objections to the adjusted wording. Okay, so now you may speak to it and introduce the motion. Thank you, Councillor.
And thank you, Mr. Mayor. We are all keenly aware that we're living in the midst of a global pandemic. Less discussed is the shadow pandemic of opioid addiction and overdose that will kill around 1,200 Albertans this year. Those are not acceptable losses. These are our fellow citizens who succumb to an illness, addiction, that science tells us is rooted in profound emotional pain. That emotional pain might be traced to traumatic childhood events or traumatic life events, as we know in the cases of soldiers and first responders. Or the emotional pain might be less acute but relentless, as with ongoing despair and hopelessness suffered by those in chronic poverty and unemployment. The wounds of emotional pain or trauma are so devastating to some victims that it can show up on brain imaging, as University of Alberta, a University of Alberta team revealed, that team led by Dr. Peter Silverstone. We fail these people. Other Albertans with chronic physical pain are provided appropriate and compassionate care, sometimes including opioids. Yet people with chronic or acute emotional pain are often left wanting. They find solace in the gateway drug, alcohol, then move on to more powerful substances. On the street today, these powerful and illegal emotional pain relievers, like fentanyl, kill. The Alberta response has been lacking. My motion today is a plea for help from the federal government, yet I have amended it slightly to open potential negotiations with the provincial government for a pragmatic response. With committee's approval, I've amended the second bullet with the motion to remove the word safe supply and replace with the term pharmaceutical replacements to illegal street drugs. Why? The term safe supply is, I believe, often misinterpreted and viewed by some as reckless distribution of more opioids to the street, though that was never the intent of my motion. I make this change with the belief that it opens the door for further or new work with the province to help operate our supportive housing facilities as therapeutic communities with programs offering pharmaceutical replacements to illegal street drugs. The original bullets asking Ottawa to declare a national health emergency and to decriminalize possession for personal use obviously remain in my motion. Decriminalization helps reduce the shame and stigma that carry the weight of mountains under the backs of the addicted. Reduction of stigma will perhaps help some people more readily reach out and ask for help. A national health emergency will help municipalities with the resources and programs they need to deal with this tragic shadow pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor McKean. So we will now hear from speakers, starting.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, there is one additional speaker who was missed on the list. So apologies for that, but it's Lindsay Billingsley, who I believe is on the line.
Lindsay Billingsley, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Can I get a motion to add Lindsay as Speaker 17?
So moved.
Thank you, Councillor McKean. I'll just seek unanimous consent. Any objections to adding her? Not hearing any. Okay, welcome, and if you can mute your mic until we come to you, we will come to you in due course. Again, you've each got up to 5 minutes. I'm going to fairly rigorously enforce the 5 minutes just so we can make sure that we do hear from everybody, and then again stay on the line for questions. So, Dr. Silverstone, I presume.
Thank you. Yes. So thank you for having me here today. Let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Peter Silverstone. I am interim chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Alberta. And I've been working in the area of drugs and the brain, what is called psychopharmacology, for over 30 years. I have also been doing a lot of research at every level, looking at the impact of a number of different compounds, including some street drugs, drugs of abuse on the brain, both in the neuroscience and behavioral science area. And my goal here is firstly to support the motion. I think it is appropriate. And secondly, to talk about some of the neuroscience and other scientific basis for why I think it is appropriate to support this motion. If I were able to amend the motion, which I'm not, the only slight change I would suggest is that on the second bullet, where it says in Edmonton utilizing pharmaceutical alternatives, I would then add under medical supervision. And the reason I would do that is I feel that it's often missed that what I believe the evidence shows, others will add their view, is that given under medical supervision, the use of appropriate pharmaceutical alternatives is extremely beneficial. And the data supporting that is very strong. And in my view, from the science, just as an independent reviewer, it's compelling. And so I do hope that the Council proceeds with this motion, because I think it can make meaningful difference to the lives of many Edmontonians and those elsewhere. Many of you may know that I have been interested in a variety of other initiatives to support Edmontonians, but I think we are really underestimating the impact that this has. This is a silent set of deaths that occurs, and by silent I mean that most of us don't interact with individuals suffering from these conditions, and the deaths seem to be relatively marginalized, which is obviously a tragedy. Councillor McKean referred to some work we had done showing, I think very interestingly and very relevant to this, that we can now detect meaningful changes in brain structure decades after childhood or early young adult abuse. That this kind of abuse that individuals still experience sadly in the society does lead to long-term brain changes. And the self-medication that a number of people use to try and cope with these changes can be very difficult. We expect to see similar changes in more recent onset conditions, post-traumatic stress disorder being an example. And this self-medication is huge. The second piece of this in terms of opiates is that, as I'm sure you're all very aware, there are many individuals who had no issues and had no trauma, but then were given opiates as part of a treatment plan by physicians, and for a variety of reasons found that it was very hard to stop using it, and in fact have increased their use. And that again speaks to the psychopharmacology of these compounds, how you get what's called upregulation of various components, and I'm sure many of the other groups will be able to talk eloquently about this. So, why am I here today? Really to make a single message, or to talk about a single message, and that is the science is clear. Medically supervised pharmaceutical alternatives to illicit drugs are safe, effective, and should be supported, just as medical use of all kinds of other drugs given under supervision is really important. So it is for this group of individuals who are coping with extremely difficult areas in their lives, and marginalization and ignoring the pain and experience they have leads to long-term detrimental outcomes for many, many individuals. So I applaud Council for considering this. I think Dr. McKean's, he wishes. I think Councillor McKean's motion is one that I fully support, and I think I will stop there and be available for questions for at least another half an hour should anybody have them.
Thank you, Dr. Silverstone. Nice to see you again. After many years of service on the Economic Development Board, so in a very different capacity here. Nice to see you. So you were just inside the 5 minutes, which is great. I should have noted that we do keep time in the room here, but we'll encourage you each to use your own timers. And Dr. Silverstone has done an excellent job of pacing himself. So we encourage each of you to do the same, just so we can hear from everybody. Ewan Thompson is next.
Thanks very much for having me in. We're excited to be here. My name is Ewan Thompson. I'm running a company called Raft Brew Labs down in Calgary, and I'm here representing each and every Businesses for Harm Reduction, which currently numbers 53 businesses in 5 municipalities across Alberta, including the following Edmonton companies: Polar Park Brewing, Bent Stick Brewing, Arcadia Brewing, Northern Chicken, Park Power, Cadenave Communications, Y Station, and Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson. Each and every Businesses for Harm Reduction aims to reduce preventable overdose deaths by destigmatizing drug use and building equity for people who use drugs. We unequivocally support Councillor McKeen's proposed motion in its entirety. I served some years as a board member for a nonprofit that deals with at-risk youth, many with traumatic backgrounds. And the executive director there had this tattoo on her arm that said, "May we be moved." This always stuck with me to mean that when you encounter somebody's story of trauma or injustice or statistics that represent many people's stories of trauma or injustice, that it moves you not just to emotion or emotional discomfort, but also to action. And that basic fundamental principle underpins our entire effort around each and every Businesses for Harm Reduction. We spoke with activist Garth Mullins early on, and he told us that in his view, businesses can talk to other businesses in ways that people who use drugs can't. So this has really informed our efforts as well, because in the past, businesses have really tried to shore up their territory and shore up their interests purely through pragmatic reasons. But we believe that when they obstruct harm reduction services as they have in the past, that this has been entirely misguided in terms of their actual business interests. For example, when you have supervised consumption sites in a location, particularly in a downtown area with a dense population, you are removing the need for many unsupervised consumption sites in that immediate surrounding area. With drug poisonings responsible for about 40% of deaths of people below 45 years of age, at least that's the BC coroner statistics right now, we need to do something about this fast. There's obvious humanitarian benefits, but beside that, Councillor McKeen's items actually address a lot of concerns that businesses would have around social disorder. If you think about safe supply or even under the new terminology that Scott McKeen is proposing, petty crime should actually see a decrease because people have no more need or lesser need to break into places and so on to get the money and get the resources to get those drugs to ensure their daily survival. I'll leave it to others to speak to the intangible benefits of decriminalizing the very daily existence of people who use drugs. But again, this is, as Councillor McKeen noted, highly rooted in trauma and something that we need to be dealing with societally. The benefits of community inclusivity are always going to be good for businesses, having more people feeling safer in front of their storefronts, less police activity. That's always going to be a good thing for driving positive business outcomes. In the conversations that I've actually had with businesses operating near supervised consumption sites, I have not heard a single person, a single business owner say that they are against harm reduction in principle. They just don't like the way that the programs have been rolled out in the past. So the prevailing view is that these programs and services need more resources, not less, more thoughtful deployment of these resources and more support from all levels of government. So each and every Businesses for Harm Reduction is implementing a campaign to introduce naloxone into as many businesses as possible. This is going to happen in rural areas, urban areas, everything. And the idea is that we're going to try and announce ourselves as caring neighbors and allies to people who use drugs and all members of our communities. We think that by doing this, we should expect a similar level of care and respect in return. Councillors and Mayor Iveson, the fiscal debate around harm reduction is over, as is the moral debate. Councillor McKeen's proposed motion dovetails perfectly, in fact, with the mayor's current strategy on homelessness, which has been talked about at length. But we won't solve homelessness without a parallel strategy for trauma and addiction. Our first step should be to keep people alive and out of jail. May you all be moved to action today and over the coming weeks by the stories and the statistics that you hear. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is Christina Ozarek.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Christina Ovcharek. I'm the owner and operator of Exhale Brewco, member of the founding leadership committee of each and every, this is Penelope, former Calgary downtown dweller, ex-downtown bartender, nightclub door security staff, a human who has endured their own mental health, struggles with PTSD and self-medication substance issues, and one of the privileged few who has had the means and support to be able to access the services when I've needed them. This is a conversation that none of us are removed from, but too many don't understand the direct impact it has on all of us. This conversation is about harm reduction, safe supply, the role of stigmatization and inversely destigmatization, decriminalization and saving the lives in the battle with our other epidemic, our opioid crisis. I know what you're thinking. How can an alcohol producer keep a straight face while promoting harm reduction services for illegal drugs? Well, here it is. Many of us already operate supervised consumption sites with safe supply, the original ones, known to us as tap rooms, bars, and restaurants. Beyond licensed venues and serving regulations, our industry is built largely on invisible harm reduction scaffolding, legal drinking age, AGLC regulations and inspections, addiction services, safe supply, and quality control. Most of all, the widespread acceptance that people will use alcohol and the fabric of our society can absorb its harms while we enjoy its benefits. The most up-to-date data that in 2020, from January to October, 904 people died from apparent unintentional opioid poisoning in Alberta. On average, that's around 3 individuals dying every day and of unintentional opioid poisoning. And with rates dramatically increasing in the third quarter of 2020 due to COVID, we annually expect our 2021 fertility rates of up to 1,200 individuals. On top of tragic deaths, our medical system can be overwhelmed. Staggering statistics show that the provincial emergency visits related to opioids and other drug use increased from 22% in the first quarter of 2020 to the second. In the second quarter of 2020, the rate of emergency visits was approximately 11% higher than the provincial average over this period. In 2020, Calgary saw and Edmonton saw the highest number of emergency visits related to opioids and other drug use. So who is that they that are dying? Well, in a snapshot, 79% of unintentional fentanyl deaths were males. 25% of those individuals with unintentional fentanyl deaths and 60% of unintentional opioid deaths have been prescribed antidepressants in the 30 days prior to death. The fact that people are being affected look just like you and me. From a very personal position, in March 2019, I lost my best friend of 26 years to an overdose, and only 3 months later, a close friend to an unintentional opioid-related death. Both in their homes, both with a history of mental health issues, which affect more of our population than not, and both men in their 30s. This is the same population we see most frequenting our tap rooms and bars, and also the same statistical population that is being affected the greatest. It hits close to home for many of us. Relevant data also shows that we are dealing with vulnerable populations that have a history of mental health issues, trauma, higher rates of suicide, and or potentially less access to social services. Our current data is limited on race and cultural demographics. However, when we look at our vulnerable population statistics, our Indigenous population rates particularly high. Each and every are businesses who live in a regulated world of drug producing, selling, and administering. We are some of the best people to advocate in terms of drug use destigmatization and also creating evidence-based policy change. There's been a very clear division among the business community where some have been fiercely opposed and their view with all valid reasons, while others have been passively opposed. But there is hope to bridge this gap by having these conversations. Together, we can create a safer, more compassionate, and more informed and educated community supporting harm reduction. And our collective efforts will save lives and communities. Each and every 100% supports Scott's motion. Thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you, Christina, for sharing your lived experience, and sorry for your losses. Next is Mackenzie Martineau.
Thank you. Good morning, council members and fellow Albertans. My name is Mackenzie Martineau. This morning I come to stand in favor of Councillor Scott McKinn's motion. A little bit about why I'm qualified to speak on this. I spent 10 years in active substance use and addiction with all kinds of substances, including fentanyl and intravenous use, a small stint in homelessness. And then for the last 5 years, I've been living in abstinence-based recovery, working in treatment centers, in harm reduction outreach, at a supervised consumption site, as well as in the recovery community, and currently working at the assisted self-isolation site for Calgary's disadvantaged populations. So, firstly, to speak on the motion of, or the first bullet of recognizing this as an overdose crisis, I believe the latest numbers are 1,128 people released on Tuesday that have died of unintentional opioid overdose. And over the last 10 years, as we've seen the fentanyl crisis gain momentum and then death rates start to multiply exponentially, this is a crisis, and it's honestly about damn time we just recognize it as what it is. Not only for the recognition of the people that we've lost, but for the increase in funding and services available if we recognize this as a health crisis, which it is. Secondly, on the funding of Safe Supply, I am in agreement with Councillor McKean's amendment to referring to pharmacological replacement to illicit street drugs. From my own lived experience background, I've seen the benefits that this can have for folks. My specific area of expertise is with Calgary's homeless. I've watched people raise the floor from where they are using these kind of programs, starting with supervised consumption and moving their way up into programs like IOUT, which I also worked at, and seeing the same clients go from a place of absolute desperation and hopelessness and living on the streets to being housed, being stable, starting school again in a couple individuals' cases. Just wonderful examples of one site in Calgary when there could be many, many more, raising the floor for many, many other individuals. I think it's a great idea, and I've seen it work, and I think we need a lot more of them. And I believe as well, just based on Dr. Peter Silverstone's science, I'm in agreement with that as well. Like, the evidence is there. We need to do something different. And finally, on the bullet of decriminalization, I can't tell you personally in my own life and with how many other friends and colleagues and clients that I've worked with, that a huge piece of their story is them being arrested for a minuscule amount of narcotics, and how much of an impact that had on them. Our jails, our institutions are not meant for rehabilitation. They're a place of punishment. And to be punished for having a small amount of substance on you that you're actively using to, as was referred to earlier, relieve some of the psychological stress from ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, or trauma or stress, to be thrown into jail and locked up like an animal for 6 months to a year over a tiny amount of narcotics is ridiculous, and it helps no one. It costs Albertans thousands and thousands of dollars a year. It costs these people months and sometimes years out of their lives. It's a waste of resources and a waste of time, and it's enough. It's time to move past this and put that money into supporting our communities and supporting these individuals. I'd like to thank everyone for their time today, and I hope everybody has a good day.
Well, thank you very much for that perspective, Mackenzie. Appreciate you joining us this morning. Next is Lorna Thomas.
Hello, good morning. I live in Riverdale in Ward 6, and I'm here to speak strongly in support of my councillor, Scott McKean, for the motion he's put forward. I'm the co-founder of the nonprofit organization called Mums Stop the Harm, and we are a network of Canadian families impacted by substance use-related harms. 3 of us began our group in 2015. We now have 1,700 members. Many members are grieving their losses, some seeking help for their loved ones. All want to see change in our drug policies and practices. These are the photos of some of the loved ones that Mums Stop the Harm members mourn. Look at their faces. They're people from all socioeconomic, ethnic, cultural backgrounds from all regions of our country. All of us are affected by the crisis. The reasons why they might have used substances vary, but there are some common themes, especially for those where the use becomes problematic. Physical pain, mental pain, trauma, poverty, most strongly perhaps a lack of hope. The majority of our loved ones struggled with substance use, also had mental health issues. This is my son Alex when he was 17, an honors student at Victoria School. After high school in 2005, answering the promise of big money in Alberta's oil and gas industry, Alex trained as a welder. He worked long, hard hours, sometimes more than 60 hours a week, becoming depressed behind his protective welding mask. Alex passed away in May 2012. After his death, I was shocked to find out that he had been using stimulants, cocaine and meth, to help him cope with depression and his intense work schedule. He died by suicide. The stigma associated with having mental health and substance use issues prevented him from seeking help. How can a person seek help if the health problem they struggle with is criminalized? To end stigma, we have to decriminalize people who use drugs, or they will continue to use alone and die alone. Structural stigma is created by laws and policies, so we need to change those laws and policies. More people are dying at home alone, and because of the pandemic, we have dual public health emergencies. A staggering 1,128 Albertans died from opioid-related overdoses in 2020. 372 of those deaths occurred in Edmonton. Almost every community in our city saw an overdose death in 2020. The Alberta government is no longer releasing neighborhood-level data, so this map only shows the drug poisoning deaths that occurred in Edmonton between January and June 2020. It is important to note that 68% of those who died in Edmonton during that 6 months were inside homes, not in alleys or on the street. Here you see some of our Mums Stop the Harm members at a rally calling for safe supply. They are asking for pharmaceutical alternatives to illegal street drugs. Substances are increasingly toxic as new and dangerous mixtures occur. When a person lives with substance use disorder, they will use regardless of the toxicity. With safer supply, health professionals can supply prescription-grade alternatives to the people who need them. Having safer supply in Edmonton will not only benefit the citizens, the people who use the drugs to stay healthy, they will also benefit citizens who will be impacted less by the social disorder and crime associated with illicit drug trade. 18,000 Canadians have died over the past 6 years. Many municipalities are calling for action on the opioid crisis to stop preventable deaths. People can't go to treatment if they're dead. To date, 38 municipalities have endorsed various resolutions calling on the federal government to take action. We want to see Edmonton on this list. I was recently in 2 roundtable meetings with Federal Health Minister Patty Hadju and Federal Minister of Labour Philomena Tassi. They, along with the 15 of us in attendance, were discussing the impact of the drug crisis on people in the trades. That workforce is being hit hardest. Minister Hadju asked that if people were writing letters of support for decriminalization, that the letters be sent to her office as well as the Office of the Prime Minister. We ask that you endorse the motion put forward by Councillor McKean. It's up to all of us to help save the lives of the people we love.
Well, thank you very much, Lorna, and sorry for your loss as well.
Thank you.
Donald Mcpherson is next. Donald, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much for allowing me to address council today. My name is Donald Mcpherson. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. We're a national coalition of organizations and individuals working to improve Canada's approach to drugs. I'm an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University, and formerly City of Vancouver's Drug Policy Coordinator, where I worked for 12 years wrestling with these issues at the municipal level. And I know what it's like. This is big stuff for municipalities, and it's a pleasure to see Edmonton considering this motion. I'm here to speak in support of the motion, which, after working for 30 years in this field, one way or another, I strongly support it. While a motion like this reaches beyond the jurisdiction of the municipality, it also reaches to the heart of the problem in our view. That is, our drug policies need to be modernized to be relevant for these times. As you are well aware, Canada is in the grips of a catastrophic public policy failure that is taking the lives of thousands of Canadians each year. I've been engaged in this work since the 1990s, and I use the phrase public policy failure intentionally, as so much of the harm that we are seeing is driven by our overarching drug policy. I would argue more than drugs themselves. Canada's approach to drugs is badly outdated and has not been modernized to keep up with current knowledge of substance use, addiction, or the scale of the transnational global drug markets. Our current approach, a prohibition that has clearly failed and continues to fuel a robust, global, organized, and deadly criminal market that delivers drugs to communities in Canada 24/7, is no longer fit for purpose. It criminalizes otherwise law-abiding citizens and disproportionately impacts Indigenous, Black, people of color who are poor, people who are poor, underhoused, as well as those with mental health issues. The first part of the motion absolutely must happen. The federal government needs to take this crisis more seriously, act more urgently, and fund more emergency responses across the country. This is indeed a national public health emergency. With regard to the emergence of a range of programs that provide pharmaceutical alternatives to the toxic drug market across Canada, these programs are a response to the deteriorating conditions for people at risk of overdose due to the COVID pandemic. They're an innovation that are important to both protect people from a toxic drug supply at a very deadly time in the illegal drug market, and also to protect people from COVID-19. Providing alternatives responds not only to the reality that the illegal supply is toxic, it responds to the reality that people will continue to use drugs for a variety of reasons. Providing these alternatives begins to offer a consumer protection strategy in this context, and that should be a high priority, as it is with COVID-19 measures. These programs, in the forms that they exist in Canada at this time, are firmly embedded in a medical approach and involves a person who uses substances engaging a participating physician and in BC registered or psychiatric nurses that will prescribe a 3-week supply of a number of common pharmaceutical drugs. Currently, the substances include 2 opioids, 2 stimulants, a benzodiazepine. The opioids are hydromorphone and M-Eslon, a morphine sulfate. Stimulants include dexedrine and methylphenidate, commonly known as Ritalin. Programs exist in various places across the country, including BC, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, and are led primarily by physicians in partnership with community health services at this time, often in partnership with harm reduction or housing programs as well. In BC, there are approximately 2,000 people accessing what is called the Safe Supply Program that will be evaluated by the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research in Victoria. With regard to the third part of the motion, the principles of decriminalization, it is absolutely time to stop criminalizing people who possess drugs for their personal use. Continuing to criminalize people who use drugs is not good public health practice. It increases harms to individuals and is a poor use of scarce public resources. Policy change in the field of drug policy comes from the ground up most often, and municipalities have a critical role to play as the rubber meets the road at the municipal level. Modernizing our approach to drugs in this country will bring many benefits to municipalities in terms of public health and safety for all residents of Edmonton. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Chanel Tuan.
Ponce to all ladies and gentlemen of the Executive Committee, speakers, and fellow attendees. I would like to thank you for this opportunity, and also would like to acknowledge that I am joining today from Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral traditional home of the Cree, Blackfoot, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, and Métis people, also known as a Miskwa Shihahikin here in Treaty 6. My name is Chanel Tuan, and I am an Indigenous Edmontonian. I have been a frontline worker in the inner city for a nonprofit for the past 9 years, and I am connected to various organizations by and for substance users, not only across the city and province, but nationally and internationally also. I am also a community liaison for Alberta's busiest hospital, which serves just north of Edmonton's inner city. I join you today not to speak on behalf of any of the organizations that I am connected to, but as a deeply concerned citizen of Edmonton and Alberta. I am sure I do not need to impart the gravity and the seriousness of this conversation and the potential impacts to community that could possibly transpire depending on the decisions that come from this discussion today. The reality is that safe supply programs can and do save lives. I myself personally have quite literally known thousands of people who use substances in communities across our country, a country which is simultaneously experiencing devastation and destruction due to the illicit fentanyl poisonings of our fellow citizens. Some of the people that I have had the opportunity, the privilege to be connected to, are connected to programs such as IOT, and these folks have come full circle from getting housed, from some becoming employed, but most importantly, becoming healthy and reaching a level of stability that has brought them to a place that I have seen others achieve in sometimes years. IOT program has assisted individuals in reducing those years to mere months. These folks are now the healthiest and the happiest that I have ever seen them in all of the years that I've known them. Some of the folks are of Indigenous descent, some are of Caucasian descent. They come from all walks of life, and regardless of race, I want to remind us all that we are all treaty people. And as such, I'd like to draw your attention to the 10 principles and 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Framework, a reconciliation framework which is one in which Canadian political and legal, educational, religious, corporate sector, and civil society function in ways that are consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canada has endorsed, and I believe that the City of Edmonton takes seriously. I see instituting safe supply programs as a radical act of reconciliation. Considering we as Indigenous people are overrepresented in almost all of the systems in Canada and this province, the city included, I call upon you now to respect and honor.
I'm sorry, Ms. Tuan, you become muted there just in the last moment. Back up one sentence, unmute yourself, and...
Oh, thank you so much. I
No worries, carry on.
apologize. So I call upon you now to respect and honor the treaty relationships as stated in the 18th and 19th calls to action, which I'd like to share with you now. So we call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to acknowledge that the current state of Aboriginal health in Canada is a direct result of the previous Canadian government policies, including residential schools, and to recognize and implement the healthcare rights of Aboriginal people as identified in the international law, constitutional law, and under the treaties. Number 19, we call upon the federal government in consultation with Aboriginal peoples to establish measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, and to publish annual reports and assess long-term trends. Such efforts would focus on indicators such as infant mortality, maternal health, suicide, mental health, addictions, life expectancy, chronic diseases, birth rates, infant and child issues, and injury incidents, and the availability of the appropriate health services. This could be considered a community healing and reconciliation project in consultation and collaboration with survivors of the drug war. I guarantee you will see sustainable benefits aside from the economic case to help people on the path to reaching a level of stability that provides them with equitable access to healthcare and social services that provide non-judgmental, non-stigmatizing attitudes. This is a step in the right direction. A direction that promotes recovering from the stigmatizing nature of what being addicted and on the streets actually entails. So I really encourage this executive committee to take bold steps to prevent further loss of life of Edmontonians and adopt the UN's Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, guided by purpose, principle, and good faith. Please bring safe supply programming to Edmonton and take the necessary steps to ensure that no more families lose loved ones to preventable deaths. I'm not sorry. I apologize. I've neglected to set my timer, but with the remainder of my time, Mayor, I would like to have a moment of silence as our city is suffering a loss this week, as we lost a community champion, Miss Karen Turner, and would just like to have a moment of silence for Karen. Thank you.
I think we can accommodate that. Thank you, Chanel. Next is Hakik Virani.
Hi, good morning. So I'm a clinician specialist in addiction medicine here in downtown Edmonton, but I think it's probably more relevant to the discussion today that I'm also a Royal College specialist in public health for the last 15 years. And it's never been more obvious to me from public health history or in my own career that than it is now, that leadership from levels of government who aren't typically seen as having responsibility for public health is desperately needed at times of crises. When those who are charged with that responsibility hesitate to take decisive action. And so I think this motion from Councillor McKean and in front of the Executive Committee would demonstrate that type of leadership. If you could advance to the next slide. So I'll briefly comment on the first two elements of Councillor McKean's motion, which I wholeheartedly support, and then I hope to spend the bulk of my time on the final element and make some recommendations that you may consider around it. The first, of course, is that this is a public health emergency. And that term is not just a matter of seeking from the thesaurus the most harsh word to demonstrate urgency. In public health, we use that phrase very deliberately. And the World Health Organization defines it I'll paraphrase it. It's a situation where a hazard, whether it's a biological or chemical or physical or radiological hazard, causes human health impacts in excess of what we would expect in a population at a certain place and time, and where those impacts overwhelm the ordinary capacities of a system to protect the public, and where extraordinary resources and measures must be executed with urgency and magnitude proportional to the risk that we face. This is clearly that situation. It has been for a number of years, this isn't just a public health emergency. This is, as we saw recently, a public health emergency that is getting far worse. 4 people died every single day in Alberta in December of last year, and that wasn't even our worst month. So this isn't just a public health emergency, it's one that's getting worse, and I think the call to the federal government to recognize that officially is very well placed by this motion. If you could advance the next slide. You'd have a really hard time convincing me, I think 16 years ago when I was a federal medical officer of health for First Nations in Alberta and practicing clinically on reserve, that we should be prescribing more pharmaceutical opioids. And most of you have probably heard the narrative about Big Pharma's push to prescribe more oxycodone and drugs like that, and how that might have played into the situation that we're in today. And at that time, we were concerned about harm from prescribing. But today, it's with great wisdom that very smart people are urging that we reduce harm by prescribing. Because a lot has changed in the real life environment between then and now. And it would be head in the sand medicine to not recognize that. So what you're looking at on the screen there is toxicology results from a patient of mine who had a single exposure to street opioids recently by smoking them. And what she said to me was, I used some heroin. And then we looked at urine toxicology results. And I believe that all she used was what she thought was heroin or street fentanyl, which is synonymous these days. And what you see there is amphetamine, methamphetamine, atezolam, which is a designer benzodiazepine that is not used in human medicine, fentanyl, fentanyl metabolites, and carfentanil metabolites, a fentanyl analog. And then there would be other things in that specimen that we had not tested for and therefore not detected. So this isn't just an overdose crisis where people are getting unpredictable amounts of opioid. We're getting unpredictable mixtures of unpredictable classes of drugs combined together that are resulting in severe adverse outcomes. So there's really no way around this. For people who would benefit from pharmaceutical alternatives, it's going to be necessary for us to provide that. And so I'm glad to see Councillor McKean include that in his motion. If you could advance the next slide. So I sent through the clerk's office a couple of resources that I hope Mayor and councillors, you'll take some time to read. One is an article that Dr. Hainsaw from Calgary School of Public Health and I wrote for the American Journal of Public Health on the systemic and structural reasons for drug policy reform. And they may not be what you think they are. The second resource that I provided was what I think. Sorry, my timer's going off here. Was what I think is the most instructive report for cities who are contemplating decriminalization approaches from Pivot Legal Society.
Thank you, Dr. Varani. If you've got a last sentence.
Oh, this was the one where I wanted to spend most of my time. So basically, the problems with Bill C-22, if you could just actually go to my second last slide and I'll just sum up there. What I would encourage City Council to do or Executive Committee to do is push further than Bill C-22. What Bill C-22 does is repeals mandatory minimums and provides alternatives to incarceration. But it does not necessarily reduce encounters with police, which are so traumatic, especially for Black and Indigenous Edmontonians. And I can't tell you how many times I see a patient who says that they used more drug in more isolation than they would have wanted to because they were afraid of being stopped and searched by police and having those drugs confiscated, even if they weren't to go to prison or to jail.
I've got to stop you there, Dr. Varani, just out of fairness for everybody. But I'm sure there'll be some follow-up questions for you if you can stand by. So,
thank you.
Next is Alexandra Loverock.
Hey. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Alex Loverock. I'm a PhD student in public health at the University of Alberta. I'm also the chair of the Edmonton Regional Chapter of the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I'm speaking to you today on behalf of the Edmonton Regional Chapter. So we're a local chapter of a national organization that is committed to supporting drug policies that are evidence-based and that reduce harm from substances within our communities. As the Edmonton Regional Chapter, we fully support the motion brought forth by Councillor Scott McKeen. We have written an open letter voicing our support for this motion. We have sent the signed letter to the members of the Executive Committee and to the members of Council. Since Monday night, we have received 317 signatures from individuals and organizations, and we are continuing to gather support. As young people, we care deeply about these issues. Overdose deaths are very high among young adults in Alberta. We are deeply saddened that we have lost 1,281 lives in 2020 in Alberta. This high number of deaths would suggest that the overdose crisis is a public health emergency. Addiction is not a choice. People use drugs often as a way to cope with trauma or tough life circumstances, and they deserve a chance to get the help that they deserve as human beings. Many people are not ready to stop using drugs, so it is important to meet them where they are at and make sure that they can stay safe. One of the ways that we can do this is to accommodate overdose prevention programs in Edmonton. This could be helpful because in Alberta, 90% of overdose deaths are a result of illicit fentanyl. Access to prevention programs and pharmaceutical alternatives to illegal street drugs could save lives. The Edmonton Regional Chapter acknowledges that personal substance use may be harmful, so I want to make it clear that I am not here to promote substance use. However, we believe that it is hurtful to punish people for using substances by criminalizing personal drug possession. Criminalization of simple drug possession is costly and ineffective at reducing use of criminalized drugs. Possession arrests make up about 70% of drug-related arrests throughout Canada. By decriminalizing personal drug possession, police will not waste their resources on enforcing ineffective policies. Criminalization of personal drug possession is also an unjust burden to those who are criminalized and leads to unnecessary incarceration and criminal records. This creates barriers to employment and fuels a perpetual cycle of poverty, crime, and addiction that disproportionately impacts racialized groups. Criminalization can also deter the use of harm reduction services, such as supervised consumption sites, because people are scared that they will be arrested. This results in people using alone and hiding their drug use, rather than seeking treatment or harm reduction services. Across Canada, there has been a shift towards decriminalization of personal drug possession. With the president of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police openly endorsing decriminalization of personal drug possession, it is time for us to make a change. We wholeheartedly support Scott McKeen's motion, and we hope that this motion will pass. As for the next steps, we believe that the City of Edmonton should request an exemption from the federal government from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act to allow the possession of small amounts of illicit substances within the City of Edmonton. This request would be consistent with the steps taken in the cities of Vancouver, St. Catharines, and Montreal. The City of Edmonton is a wonderful Canadian city, and we believe it has the opportunity to be a leader on these urgent public health issues in Canada. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your presentation. And next is Daniel O'Brien.
Hello everyone, thanks for having me. My name is Daniel O'Brien and I'm currently a graduate student in counseling psychology at the University of Alberta, and I have a master's degree in public health. And like Alex, I'm also a member of the Edmonton chapter of the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I also want to speak today to wholeheartedly support this motion and sincerely thank Councillor McKeen for calling attention to the overdose crisis. In particular, I think the motion to provide pharmaceutical alternatives is urgently needed to reduce the overwhelming number of deaths in Edmonton caused by the toxic illegal drug supply. Along with other members of the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, I helped write an open letter supporting this mission that Alex mentioned. However, I also wanted to speak on behalf of myself today to say that I think City Council can and should do more to support the decriminalization of simple possession of drugs in Edmonton and nationally. So currently, the motion put forth by Councillor McKean calls on the Government of Canada to enact BC C-22, which amends the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And I do think Bill C-22 is a positive step in the right direction. However, it falls short of repealing the criminal prohibition of personal drug possession, which is what drug policy experts and people who use drugs across the country have called for. I think Edmonton City Council should consider amending the current motion to call for the full decriminalization of drugs at the federal level. Cities in Vancouver and Montreal and the Board of Health of Toronto have all urged the Government of Canada to decriminalize the possession of drugs, and currently authorities in Vancouver are coordinating with Health Canada to develop a plan to decriminalize drug possession within city limits. So there are several reasons why I think the full decriminalization of drugs would be more beneficial than the proposed amendments in Bill C-22. So BC C-22 would allow police and prosecutors to consider alternatives to prosecution, such as taking no action, providing a referral to voluntary services, or diverting individuals to treatment instead of imposing criminal sanctions. However, police and prosecutors can still give a warning that can be recorded in a police database. They can still charge individuals, and they can still impose criminal sanctions at their discretion. This means that in every interaction between people who use drugs and the police, there will still be the continued threat of being stopped, being interrogated, being detained, or being prosecuted. I think that these continued threats are unjust violations of personal freedoms, and I'm concerned that people who use drugs will continue to fear interactions with the police. This fear can push people to use drugs in isolation and make it difficult to take safety precautions. For example, people who use drugs may be deterred from accessing supervised consumption services because traveling there in possession of drugs is still technically illegal. Additionally, I truly believe that as long as drugs are criminalized, people who use drugs will continue to be stigmatized. Stigma causes people to hide their drug use from their friends, families, and service providers and be reluctant to seek help if they need it. I think that the full decriminalization of drug possession is needed to dismantle the stigmatizing belief that drug use is a criminal activity. It is somewhat paradoxical that Bill C-22 calls for substance use to be addressed as a health and social issue instead of a criminal one, yet continues to criminalize drug possession. Finally, I worry that giving police and prosecutors too much discretionary power will mean that Black and Indigenous citizens will continue to be disproportionately impacted by drug criminalization. So for these reasons, I would like to see the City of Edmonton be a leader on this issue by calling for the full repeal of criminal prohibition on simple drug possession. I hope that continued pressure from major cities across Canada will eventually cause the Government of Canada to make this much needed change. And I sincerely thank you for allowing me to speak on this issue. And I thank Councillor Scott McKean again for this very important motion.
Thank you for those comments, Daniel. Next up is Natalie Reed.
My name is Natalie Reed, and I am a resident of Edmonton, Alberta. I'm an undergraduate criminology student at the University of Alberta, and I've spent the last several years working with community members experiencing homelessness, mental health concerns, and addictions. I am strongly in favor of Scott McKean's motion. As a member of the Edmonton community, a student, and a frontline worker, I believe it is crucial that the City of Edmonton take an informed and evidence-based approach to dealing with the overdose crisis in Alberta and take the opportunity to become a leader on this issue by introducing safe supply and harm reduction approaches. Over the last year, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a spike in the number of overdose deaths across Alberta, and there are many potential explanations for this spike, including an increase in drug toxicity due to closed borders and increased numbers of people using alone. With all of that being said, I believe the best approach that the City of Edmonton can take to tackle this important issue is to pass the motion put forward by Scott McKean and stand with those most vulnerable populations during the pandemic. In my work over the last year, we have tragically lost several community members and clients who I firmly believe would still be here today if safe consumption and harm reduction programs had been in place. In addition, I've seen countless clients face criminalization for their suffering and addictions, and this criminalization further isolates and traumatizes them, putting them in a worse place to battle their addictions and subsequently resulting in worse addiction problems. Although I'm not speaking on behalf of any organizations today, I've seen firsthand the impact of the overdose crisis, and as a citizen, I wanted to voice my opinion on this important issue. I applaud Councillor McKean for bringing forward this motion, and I hope to see similar motions coming forward in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Next is Dr. Elaine Hishka.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to address the Executive Committee. My name is Elaine Hishka, and I am an assistant professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. And since 2019, I have been advising Health Canada on the provision of pharmaceutical alternatives to illegal street drugs, including currently serving as the chair of their expert advisory group on safer supply. In addition to this, I'm also part of the investigative team of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research funded national study examining the provision of safe supply in various jurisdictions across this country. I'm here today to probably shore up and echo many of the points that have already been made today, but also to give you a sense of my experience involved directly in federal policymaking on this topic. But before I begin, I'd like to just clearly define what we're talking about when we talk about safer supply or the provision of pharmaceutical alternatives to illegal street drugs. The overdose epidemic in Alberta and in Canada is extremely acute, as we've heard. We have had for a long time problems with opioid-related overdose deaths in particular, beginning in the late 90s, early 2000s. But it wasn't until about 2014 that we saw overdose deaths go from about 100 a year in Alberta to now, last year, 1,200 people died. What has been the significant factor that has changed is not the rate of addiction in the population or the number of people who are using drugs. It has been a fundamental shift in the illegal market. The illegal market has become so highly toxic that people who used to get into trouble with drugs, potentially spend a few years in addiction, either find treatment or naturally recover, which most people do, as the science shows. Those people no longer have that opportunity because they're taking such highly toxic illegal substances and experiencing high rates of overdose. So the provision of pharmaceutical alternatives to illegal street drugs is really about connecting people who are not ready or able or willing to access conventional treatment like methadone, buprenorphine, or other opioid agonist treatments, which are the gold standard for opioid use disorder, and connecting them to medical care and the provision of pharmaceutical-grade alternatives to purchasing street drugs. This is done with the intention to help people stabilize their substance use as well as their lives and other factors of their lives, to reduce their involvement in acquisitive crime conducted to purchase or fund illegal drugs or sex work, and to improve their health and focus and enable them to focus on other priorities. It may lead to the reduction or cessation of drug use for some, but it is 100% not a precondition of safe supply or pharmaceutical alternative provision that people are seeking abstinence. Abstinence may be a byproduct, but that is not the intent of these programs. These programs provide a bridge for people to be stabilized and healthy while they're using drugs. So recognizing that there was this gap and that people who were not seeking treatment, and that is a significant proportion of people at any given time that are using opioids, upwards of 40%, who are not willing or able to seek treatment, recognizing this gap, Health Canada did fund several different pilot programs across the country to test out the provision of pharmaceutical alternatives as a bridge for people towards better health and healthcare. There are now pilot programs operating in Fredericton, Cape Breton, Dartmouth, Halifax, London, Vancouver, Victoria, multiple programs in Toronto and Ottawa, and a new one is planned for Montreal. This is not new in Canada. This has now been undergoing planning and implementation since 2019. And Alberta is increasingly an outlier in not having any of these programs as a tool to address the overdose epidemic. The planning for these programs was undertaken with rigorous study in partnership with people who had expertise in the medical regulation, pharmaceutical regulation, as well as people with lived experience and medical experts. And I strongly believe that they have the potential to significantly increase or significantly decrease overdose risk for people who are using opioids in Edmonton. And to put that in perspective, we know that there was 376 people that died of an opioid-related overdose in Edmonton last year. Just 4% or almost 5% died from a pharmaceutical drug opioid overdose. Of course, it is not, there's never anything inherently safe about taking any psychoactive substance, including alcohol or opioids. But we do know that pharmaceutical grade alternatives are much, much safer for people who are using opioids than forcing them to buy illegal drugs, highly toxic illegal drugs from street markets. So I would urge council to strongly endorse this motion and to write to Health Canada to ask directly for funding to fund safe supply pilot programs and operate them in Edmonton for people at risk of overdose. And I'd also strongly encourage the council to heed the advice of other speakers today and to more strongly endorse the need for minor drug possession within the city limits of Edmonton. I think combined with safe supply, there is really significant potential to earn the tide on overdose deaths in our city if people do not feel stigmatized in seeking care, do not fear risk of arrest, and they have options, including pharmaceutical drugs, to bridge them and connect them. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Phil Burgess.
Good morning. I do apologize. I don't have a camera working right now, but hopefully you can hear me loud and clear. My name's Phil Burgess, owner and operator of Polar Park Brewing Co., located at 10416 80th Avenue, Northwest, 2 blocks south of White Ave. Polar Park recognizes that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional meeting land and home of Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, and the Nakota Sioux peoples. I'm speaking to you today in support of Councillor Scott McKean's motion to call on the federal government to declare the opioid crisis a national public health emergency in an effort to launch a safe supply drug pilot program in Edmonton. I'm also speaking to you today as a manufacturer and distributor of a controlled substance, alcohol. Having moved to Edmonton from Vancouver's downtown east side in 2018 to open my business, I'm no stranger to drug use or drug addiction. Although it may be viewed as hypocritical for a manufacturer of a controlled substance to push these benefits, I do this as a necessity to prevent the countless and preventable deaths Albertans experience every day from drug overdoses. In my profession, and like many others speaking today, all controlled substances that we produce are countlessly monitored and tested to ensure a safe supply for our customers. In addition, we have multiple regulatory bodies to make sure we are operating within specific guidelines. The times of bootlegged alcohol causing blindness and death are no longer or are extremely low as a result of these measures put in place. However, today, we often refer to this crisis as an overdose crisis, but really, we're in a drug poisoning crisis due to the contamination of illicit drug supply. It's time we bring the standards we have for alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis to that of the illicit drug supply market. It wasn't long ago that the treatment of mental illness lacked legitimacy amongst professionals. It was believed to reflect individual weakness or poor life choices, opposed to taking it as seriously as we would with the disease of the body. Thankfully, we've overcome this mindset and have put a strong effort on addressing illnesses such as depression and anxiety. It's time we do the same for our friends, colleagues, and loved ones, all who very well could be users of this contaminated illicit drug supply. If you haven't experienced the heartbreak from losing someone close to you as a result of the drug poisoning crisis we live in, it's only a matter of time until you do. In an effort to help prevent the unnecessary deaths caused by an overdose, my business has trained our staff on the use of naloxone from the very beginning, ensuring them that knowing this information will increase their chances of being a superhero and saving lives. This also carries out to our alleyways, neighborhood parking lots, and anywhere else anyone may choose to use around our business. Whether a patron or someone dealing with homelessness, we've taught our staff to help prevent these unnecessary deaths wherever they go. One of the problems we face as business owners and employees is that we do not fit under the Good Samaritan Act when currently employed or on the clock, opening us up to potential lawsuits in the event that we accidentally injure someone when administering naloxone through needle injection. Although the Narcan nasal spray is much easier to administer and lowers the chance of injury, it comes at a price when the other auto-injector is free of cost from most pharmacies. Joining the voice of each and every, along with the other 50-plus Albertan businesses who signed up to reduce preventable overdose deaths, has given us the confidence to push the boundaries further than simply having an opioid antagonist on hand. I hope that in hearing our personal stories and struggles with the drug poisoning crisis that we're all currently living in, will provide further evidence that something drastic must change in an effort for us to save countless lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Next is Darren McGowan.
Hello, thanks for having me today, City Council. My name is Darren McGowan, owner and operator of Arcadia Brewing Co. I also have my nonprofit, Time for Kindness, that I've worked closely with the Boyle Street Community Services for years now, putting on Christmas dinners, supplying water in the summertime, Thanksgiving dinners, coat drives, our Time for Kindness block party, and our Be More Kind Day on September 11th. I've worked closely with the Boyle Street for years now, and I see firsthand of people on the street there, the people in the community center, and what they're dealing with. I highly support Scott McKean's motion. Like as Phil said, we're, as providers of alcohol, we have to supply people with a safe amount of alcohol. It's with AGLC, and I support the safe supply of opioids to people in our streets, because they're no different than a patron coming into our tap rooms. Arcadia is a safe site for people to come in with alcohol. We be it with bouncers or, cutting people off, and I don't feel any different of how we should be treating people coming into a business than we do out in the street. The decriminalization, just talking with the Boyle Street, educating myself over the years of what it's like for people out there, and dealing with people in Vancouver who work at safe sites and Victoria. This is just the right thing to do, and I fully support it. So thank you for your time.
And thank you for your comments. Next up is Dave Ward.
Tanse, council members and community advocates. I have to say it's so great to live in a city where the mayor speaks better Cree than I do. I think if we went into some of the other parts of our language, I might give you a go, but I really appreciate that. I'm the executive director for I'm the executive director for Niganan Housing Ventures, and I oversee the operations at Ambrose Place. For those of you that don't know, Ambrose Place is a 42-unit supportive living facility, a licensed supportive living accommodations facility, and we house some of Edmonton's hardest to house Indigenous people. We are very fortunate to have a staffing model that includes LPNs, healthcare aides, housing support staff, elders, and embedded AHS staff that include intake social workers, occupational therapists, addictions counselors, and rec therapist. A significant number of our residents are impacted by alcohol and drug use, and I just want to thank Councillor McKean for all you do. But in this instance, I want to bring forward my appreciation and support of this motion. I'm here to speak on behalf and in favor of this motion, and I want to share a little bit about, I was just recently invited to share a little bit about a presentation that we actually did yesterday to Reach Edmonton. We have a program that we call What Would It Take? And we have drug users that are residents that came forward and built a relationship with our staff over time, and we're able to have a transparent conversation and really ask the question about what would it take? What would it take to prevent you from using and slow down your use, and to get to a baseline where we can start having conversations about family connection, identity, reconnection to culture and language, and all of those things that our people are in search of. Our program is guided by natural law. So for those of you that don't know, those are 4 major elements that we live by: kindness, honesty, sharing, to build strength in each other. Our team undertakes that relationship building process in order to get to a very honest conversation with our clients. And that simple question, what would it take, led to us opening up the possibility of having a managed cannabis program. So one of our opioid users said that if I could only smoke cannabis or have access to cannabis, that would allow me to slow down my use. And so being a facility that listens to our residents and is driven by our residents' needs, we created a managed cannabis program. We also have been running a managed alcohol program for the last several years that have had a major impact on our residents and their baseline. One of the things I wanted to speak to specifically in this is that no public dollars go into any of these programs. Our staff work with our residents on financial literacy, and they structure their income to manage their rent and obligations and for the purchase of whatever it is, whether it's alcohol or cannabis. And they have an agreement in place that outlines how that alcohol or cannabis will be distributed throughout the course of a month so that an individual can actually not spend all their money in 3 days after they receive their check, but to survive and get through that whole duration of the month. That takes a while, obviously, to get there, but we've seen the impact of that and the positive impact of it. We've had opioid users and crystal meth users on a regular that have started participating in the program, and because they see their neighbors using it and they see the impacts that their neighbors are having on their lives by participating in these programs, we've had more and more people come forward. At this point, we have 11 participants in both of these in this program, and out of 42 residents, that's a pretty good number, given the fact that our top floor is all sober living. So when individuals and governments talk about harm reduction being, not having an abstinence destination, it's clearly uninformed, and we live that experience here daily. We've one of the gentlemen, unfortunately, in our facility, we lost one of our PDD clients to the opioid crisis a few months back. And I was having a conversation with a good friend who is also a PDD client of ours here. And he had said to me that he had warned this friend of his, like, don't go anywhere else to buy your stuff. We have to go to the same guy we go to. And, I don't know who those suppliers are. They don't obviously give us names, but we're able to have transparent conversations to know that they're consistent about where they get their supply. And that's a critical stage to get to with these relationships, so that we know that if that changes, and unfortunately that changed for this young individual, and unfortunately he passed away behind Bowen Macaulay Health Center. Of course, I check in with our other resident, and he reinforced to me, and I have it quoted here, I told him not to go anywhere else to get his stuff. He did, and this is what happened, and we miss him. I asked him to stay seeing our supplier, and he said, yes, I will. And this is the gentleman sharing with me. And he said, yes, I'm committed to quitting, and these programs are helping me. And I'm happy to report that just yesterday, this resident of ours over the last 3 years who came here using every second of every minute of every day has checked himself into detox, and he's registered to attend Palmacres Lodge within the next few weeks or few days. So when people suggest that programs like this don't have a destination of abstinence, it might take longer for some people. It doesn't just have a crisis and you go to treatment and everything is great. It's a lifelong learning journey that we're on, and everybody's pathway is different, and our relationship and our purpose on this journey that we are all on is unique to each and every one of us, and we need to provide opportunities for people to be successful in whatever way that they need to be. In this program and programs like it are critical.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you for that. Top way.
Thank you.
Kaylee Thomas is last. Then we'll move into questions. Kaylee? Oh, sorry. Kaylee,
Good afternoon.
Kaylee and then Lindsay. Apologies. Kaylee, you're next, and then Lindsay, then questions. Go ahead.
My name is Kaylee Thomas, and I have been authorized to read this letter on behalf of Joanna Wong, who is a pharmacist at Market Drugs Medical. Joanna is at work this morning, but she is strongly in support of Councillor McKean's motion. Dear Mayor Iveson and Councillor McKean, I started my career in pharmacy in 1987 as a pharmacy intern in the inner city of Edmonton, the Boyle Street area, and have been a pharmacist in this area for over 30 years. I've seen the rise and fall of this community for over 3 decades, but what has remained consistent is the issue of drug and alcohol use in the neighborhood and the alarming increasing rate of death by overdose year after year. The COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the opioid overdose crisis, not just in the downtown core of Edmonton, but all across the city. This is not surprising to most medical professionals. Even under the best circumstances, we know that addiction is a disease prone to relapse. A very high number of people who misuse drugs will return to them at some point during recovery, as this is often the only coping mechanism they know during periods of intense stress. Unfortunately, this period of abstinence during their recovery will leave the most vulnerable to overdose as their tolerance has dropped dramatically. The pandemic lockdown created the perfect storm for substance misuse and overdose. Routines and in-person support services have been disrupted. Economic and coronavirus worries have triggered relapses in people who have been sober for many years, and social distancing guidelines make it more likely for people to get high alone, away from those who can help. As coroners in Edmonton brace themselves to investigate the deaths by COVID-19, I wonder if they knew that they would be investigating equal numbers of deaths by overdose. Did the COVID-19 pandemic trigger this shadow crisis? I personally do not think so. I think it has always been here, but hidden. The pandemic has allowed the opioid crisis to be peeled back and has revealed to the public how severe the situation truly is. Policy changes such as the availability of naloxone kits in pharmacies and supervised injection sites around the city have helped, but these are only small steps forward in this crisis. Much more needs to be done to stop all of the unnecessary deaths. This is why I support Councillor Scott McKean 100% in his motion to have our federal government declare a national health emergency in regards to opioid overdose deaths. It is important to involve all 3 levels of government, federal, provincial, and municipal, so resources can be mobilized across the country to deal with this escalating issue efficiently and effectively. Decriminalization of illegal drugs and providing a safe supply are the best initial steps forward to help those suffering from substance use. These initiatives are the helping hands to bring people back in from traumatizing years of drug use, so a multifaceted, supervised recovery can be initiated. Communities and small businesses will also benefit from less drug-related crime and drug debris as a result. As we are regaining control over the COVID-19 pandemic, the opioid epidemic will continue to rise even as COVID-19 infection rates fall, unless more is being done. They call this opioid crisis the shadow pandemic. I think it is time to take this out of the shadows. Opioid and substance abuse needs to be treated like any other disease with treatment integrated into mainstream medicine. There needs to be a national policy for treatment and prevention programs. Thank you for your time. Joanna Wong, pharmacist at Market Drugs Medical.
Well, thank you, Kaylee, and please pass along our thanks to Joanna for those comments.
Absolutely.
And next is Lindsay Billingsley.
One morning in early June of 2017, I received a call from one of our local recovery houses, a frantic and panicked support worker asking if there was any way that I would go and support the family of a previous client. A client who had just died of a fentanyl overdose in her room by herself in a treatment center. While it had been almost a year since I had any interaction with the family, there was no one else with the training to be able to support them through such a difficult moment, and there was no way that I could say no. So I went to their home, and I held space for that family as they fell to pieces, and attempted to make sense of a world that would never be the same again. It was an honor and a privilege, but those hours spent are etched in my mind forever. My name is Lindsay Billingsley, and I'm a clinical counselor and a social worker who has spent the last 15 years working directly with young people and their families who are struggling with substance use and mental health. I have worked in detox, in supportive recovery, and I've spent 5 years working in a mandated residential treatment center for young women coming out of jail. And it is from there that I made the decision to return to do a master's degree so that I could support young people long-term out in our community, back in their homes, where there were no supports and where nothing had changed. So I'm sure it will come as no surprise that I'm here today to express my explicit support for Councillor McKean's motion in full. Statistics show that at least half of Canadians will struggle with their mental health before the age of 40. However, it has become clear that Canada's overburdened healthcare system is not able to support all who suffer adequately. This is evidenced by the ongoing overdose crisis, which has killed more than 16,000 Canadians in the last 5 years. Thousands more continue to struggle each day with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and addiction. Illnesses that are all rooted in trauma, and traumas that often took place in childhood and adolescence. When we think about a child or a young person who's been wounded or hurt, what comes up for you? It might be compassion, concern, care, perhaps a willingness to do anything to help this innocent human being heal. But the interesting thing is that as this wounded child ages and becomes a wounded adult who's doing their best to cope, an adult who may have turned to using drugs as a way to numb their pain, our compassion and concern seem to shrivel up and disappear. But why? Treatment for mental health is largely ineffective, especially for PTSD and trauma. As a mental health professional, I have seen our system fail to heal these wounded children over and over and over. So I wonder, can you connect to that child, the one you so easily offer your care and compassion to, and offer the same to the adult human being who is suffering so deeply? I'd like to end with another short story, if I may. In 2005, I was completing my social work degree, and my practicum was at a men's recovery house. The house was doing a hot dog sale at the local grocery store to raise money for its program. And I can still remember the connection I felt to the community as they shared their stories with me about their own or their family members' struggles with substances. But what I remember most clearly is my realization that the only people who were donating money were those who had been directly impacted by substance use. In fact, I remember one man who asked what the fundraiser was for, and when he found out it was in support of a recovery house, he put his money back in his pocket and he walked away. As a community, we have a decision to make. Either we continue to support a broken system that treats trauma as a crime that requires punishment, the results of which can only be more lost lives, or we can begin the necessary task of reimagining a system that remembers the human and those that society would rather label as other. So in closing, I would like to make a suggestion. If we're willing, instead of calling one another out, what if we called one another in? Into a place of compassionate curiosity, into a place of connection, and into a place of true community. Thank you for your time this morning. Be well.
That was quite the last word. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you to all of our speakers for your contributions this morning. We'll take a moment here to activate the speakers list, but since it's Councillor McKean's initiative, I'll go to him first with questions for our speakers. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Don. And I wanted to thank all the speakers. It was very, very much appreciated and very powerful. And I would just introduce our last speaker, Lindsay, as someone who reached out to my office months ago because she'd heard we were involved in these issues and just asked how she could help. And Dave Ward, I saw that presentation yesterday. Man, I love Ambrose Place and what they're doing there. in bringing health and healing to people who have had a hard life. Dr. Virani, I will pick on you. You ran out of time, which is maybe no surprise given your capacity. But the motion is perhaps amendable. I can't amend my own motion, but it was the decriminalization point is really poignant for you, and you didn't get an opportunity to finish up. So please, what was bring home the points you wanted to make?
Yeah, and I think that there was a few speakers who made similar points. So the imperative, I think, in any social policy is to advance and enhance quality of life for individuals and communities. And I don't think that is any different for drug policy. But our drug policies have had a misplaced goal of limiting drug use. And we've demonstrated for decades that our current drug policies do not achieve that, and that they do the opposite of what any good social policy would do, which is they're to the detriment of quality of life and for specific individuals who at this, or populations who at this moment in history we have to be acutely concerned about. In Canada, we're talking about Indigenous and Black Canadians. And we're also, in COVID, it's laid bare our failures of people who are experiencing poverty or who are otherwise marginalized. And unfortunately, leaving discretion in our system without consistent and transparent application of drug laws and leaving discretion to police officers, it leaves us in a situation where those vulnerable groups remain vulnerable. I did mention that clinically that presents itself as people change drug use habits because of fears of how the law will apply to them. And that will persist even if Bill C-22 is passed. If those amendments are made, those fears will still persist of encounters with police, right? Talk about trauma. Many Canadians experience trauma as adults from encounters with police, even if they don't find themselves in the courts and in jails. So those are kind of the salient points I think we need to keep in mind and why we won't get to the place we need to with C-22. And then there's basically the Pivot Legal Society report is a manual for how can a city get to a place of full decriminalization by asking for a Section 56 exemption from the Minister of Health. And there was speakers who spoke to how that process would take place.
Thank you. I've lost his name, but he was from, was it Richard, who was talking about the criminal underground that supports this toxic drug supply. But, you know, it's one of the things we've talked about the impact on the individual. And that is obviously really why we're here today. But if anybody wanted to weigh in on, we have deferred or allowed criminal gangs to be the prescribers and dispensers of medications that people seek out, and the impacts of that has on our communities. And Dr. Virani, when you talk about decrim, you're not talking about decriminalizing the distribution of illicit drugs, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. The caveat, though, is that, you know, I am concerned about those people who are, you know, low-level drug dealers who are using to support their own habits. But yes, this is not safe supply, decriminalization is not a move to decriminalize large drug dealers.
Right. Mr. Barrett, I'm about to run out of time. I might come around again. Thank you.
Certainly. Councillor Walters?
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thanks to Councillor McKean for putting this before us today, and thanks to all the speakers for your testimonies and your experiences and for sharing them here today. I wanted to start with Mr. Ward. You're still there. You know, I really appreciated the emphasis that you put on this work being all about a pathway to abstinence and recovery. You know, I think there's been this notion, you know, for whatever reason, this notion perpetuated that, our community here in Edmonton, whether it be the city of Edmonton or harm reduction advocates or agencies that, we don't believe in treatment or recovery or abstinence ultimately. Can you talk a little bit about why you think that perception exists? I don't know if Mr. Ward is still there.
Looks like he's not on the call.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Well, maybe I'll shift to Dr. Hishka, and I'll ask that same question about that perception that we have. That this community here in Edmonton, as rich as it is, I think the richness is demonstrated by the submissions this morning. Why there is that perception.
I'm sorry, that was why there's the perception that Edmonton does not support healing and recovery for people who are using substances.
Yeah, we've heard, and I think he talked about it in his submission that, we're this myth that we're not about, we're not on this pathway to recovery and abstinence.
Yeah, that's it. So I think that's a really important question. And I think what we need to understand about substance use in general and substance use disorders in particular is that, people use drugs for a whole host and variety of reasons. And the statistics actually show that the majority of people who use illegal drugs will not develop addiction or substance use disorder because of that use. Many people get involved with some minor drug use in their younger years, and then they take on more responsibility as adults, and there becomes less of a place for that use in their lives, and they kind of age out of it. That's the majority of people. But for some people who try drugs or alcohol or other types of substances, that use turns into a pattern that is problematic in their lives, and they may develop a substance use disorder. That is often predicted by negative adverse, early life experiences, trauma, comorbid mental health conditions, but it's not always the case. Sometimes, people living in poverty or facing the extreme grind of homelessness, engage in drug use as a way to cope with those broader challenges. And so I think it's important to recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for people who use drugs. Many people who use drugs do not need treatment, and it would be inappropriate to send them there because they don't meet clinical criteria for treatment. Others who are struggling with drug use may still recover or stop using or moderate their use without any kind of counseling or medical intervention. Others, though, will require more intensive care. That could be through supervised use of medications or structured addiction treatments like injectable opioid agonist treatment, oral opioid agonist medications like buprenorphine or methadone. And others still will require those medications if we're talking about opioids, and also potentially some pretty intensive psychosocial support. So whether that be through residential treatment or through psychiatry or psychological counseling. I think Edmonton clearly supports people to seek the path they need to get better and to have a better life. And, in some cases that may just be about getting stable income, getting out of the legal drug market, and getting housing. In others, it'll be about, intensive clinical care. And so when we talk about recovery, I think what we're talking about is giving people an option to define for themselves what their well-being looks like and to move towards that option.
So people aren't going to recover in the same way, is the point.
No, and it would be inaccurate and very reductionist to think that there is one solution for everybody that uses substances, and if they don't use that solution, it's not true recovery.
So do you think that this motion and the actions contained within it is oriented towards, helping people heal, helping keep people alive, and helping people recover ultimately?
100%. And I would say, it's cliche at this point, but really, if people overdose and die, they have no chance of recovery. And so getting people out of the legal market, helping them stabilize their substance use, if needed, connecting them to housing and income, if needed, connecting them to treatment, those are options for people. So safe supply or pharmaceutical alternatives to street drugs. It gives people the ability to develop trust in the healthcare system and to have someone that will support them to define and move towards their recovery. And it gives them options, and it lets them decide for themselves what will work in their lives. And I think all of us who have ever struggled with a health condition or a mental health condition know that there is not one solution for everybody, and that we all define our own journeys when it comes to healing. And it's important that people are given that opportunity to do so and not have specific solutions imposed on them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hamilton is next.
I don't have any questions for the speakers, but I did want to acknowledge what everyone has shared today, the tremendous amount of research and the personal experiences and personal stories. And I just wanted to remark that my intention is to support Councillor McKean's motion. I think there will be a bit of finagling with the wording, but I just wanted to acknowledge what's been shared today and to thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Councillor Banga.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks to each and every one of the speakers today for their passionate testimonies and experiences. I don't know who to start with. However, Ewan Thompson, I guess I'm going to pick on you first. You mentioned that these drug eventually, the drug consumption with the safe consumption sites and decriminalization, the drug use would go down. And in my policing days, I used to teach their program, Drug Awareness Education Program. And I was under the impression, correct me if I'm wrong, that these drugs are so highly addicting, I guess, once you take some, you need more and more every time to reach the same high. So even if somebody is prescribed a safe amount of drug, what's safe today, eventually they need more and more to reach their high. And for that reason, once they have consumed their regular supplies, would they go back again into the same life that is crime and disorder, etc., etc.?
So is your question, do I believe that introducing supervised consumption sites is going to reduce drug use?
Yes.
No, I don't believe that. I don't know that the data supports that, but in the business community's perspective, at least the businesses that I represent with each and every, it's not to us to decide what people do with their time or with their lives, and those decisions are entirely their own to make. We're not here to tell people that they should or should not drink alcohol or that they should or should not use drugs. Our interest is in preserving life within our communities and producing more inclusivity within those. And I do remember the DARE program well. I grew up within that framework of drug education, and I don't buy into it at all. Thank you.
Right. Dr. Birani, I would like to get your expert opinion on this again, that once somebody is addicted to drugs, they need more and more of that drug to reach the same level or same high. How could we actually have a safe supply for a person?
Yeah, so I understand that that's a prevailing narrative when it comes to substances that some people become addicted to. It's thankfully it's not true. That most people who use drugs require more and more and more drug to achieve the same effect. If somebody goes to a hockey game and they generally have a beer in the first period and the third period, the next time they go to a hockey game, they don't need to have 2 beers in the first period and 2 beers in the third period to achieve the same effect. And it's the same with all psychoactive substances. People use them until they achieve the effect that they were hoping to achieve, and that it's more of a benefit than a detriment to them to use, and then they stop. And that's the vast majority of cases. There are, of course, some people who find themselves in a disordered pattern of use that sometimes is characterized by increasing amounts, and sometimes that's for a short period of time until they have a period of abstinence, and then they can go back to the same amount that they were using before. With the overdose crisis and the toxic drug supply, this becomes a challenge because people may not use for a while and then use even small amounts of an unknown mixture of unknown classes of drugs that may include opioids, but also others. And then they're hurt by that substance. In the context where safer supply or pharmaceutical alternatives are offered, they'll actually know what they're taking. They'll actually know what dosage of what they're taking. And their ability to manage the risk of their use improves. And that's the reason why safer supply initiatives will be so helpful in this context.
Thank you so much.
Councillor McKean.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to start with Donald Mcpherson. I forgot your name last time. I apologize, sir, if you're still there. You talked in your submission a little bit about the impacts and side effects on a community in regards to the criminal underworld or infrastructure that is behind the illegal drug supply. And I guess my question is, do these provisions we're talking about today start to undermine that structure, and what would be the benefit of that?
I think what we're seeing with the emergence of programs to replace the toxic street supply is for us is the beginning of giving people an alternative to a vast, transnational, highly organized, criminally controlled import-export drug market that exists in every community in this country and most communities globally. So diverting people, giving people access to a safer alternative pharmaceutical product will indeed take pressures off people in terms of the COVID-19 restrictions, and in terms of finding money to access a drug market. It will have a small impact unless scaled up robustly. In British Columbia, there are thousands and thousands and thousands more people that could be accessing the Safe Supply program here if it were organized efficiently, if it was a proportional response to the number of people who are at risk every single day and night in BC. It would have a much bigger impact on the illegal supply of drugs. So it's really opening the door to those conversations, and I think it's a really important part of the conversation that needs to be considered as we look at what we're doing. We are actually accomplishing a number of things by moving in this direction, including impacting the illegal drug market with all of its negative impacts on individuals, families, and communities in Edmonton, in Alberta, in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Mcpherson. Dr. Hishka, you know this realm far better than I do, but the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, I believe, have come out in favor of decriminalization. Have they come out in favor of pharmaceutical alternatives, or is that? Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, in last year, they tabled a report, I think it was in the end of the summer, and it was exploring primarily the question of whether Canada should decriminalize minor possession, and if so, what that would look like. In part of their recommendations, though, they did define and explore safe supply or the provision of pharmaceutical alternatives to illegal street drugs, and they did endorse those programs, saying that they felt they would reduce the need for people to be engaged in property crime, sex work, and other illegal activity to support substance use. So they are indeed supportive. I'd also add, too, that I recently had the opportunity to collaborate on a public opinion research project in Alberta with Dr. Jared Wesley at the University of Alberta, and we actually did some polling around different solutions to the overdose epidemic, and we found that close to 60% of Albertans are also in favor of the provision of pharmaceutical alternatives to illegal street drugs, and I believe that's quite remarkable considering that this is not a widely known program, and obviously shows that people have an open mind and recognize the severity of the situation we're in.
I wanted to just quickly ask you, because I think Councillor Banga raises a really interesting question that I came into this with, and is my understanding, and tell me if I'm correct, that only a minority of people who even maybe use a powerful drug like cocaine actually become dependent or addicted on it.
Yeah, that's correct. The estimates do vary according to the population, and because illegal drug use is illegal, it can be hard to measure. But generally speaking, the estimates are about between 5 and 25 to 30% of people who use illegal drugs, like over a period of time, will develop a problem with them. So it really depends on the substance and the pattern of use. With pharmaceutical grade opioids, there is some research as well that shows like longer term prescribing for pain or acute pain is a lower magnitude of problematic use as well. So around like 5 to 10%, I believe. And I'd ask Dr. Randy to correct me if I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah. About 1 in 20 people who are prescribed opioids for chronic pain chronically will develop a problem with it. And that's nothing to be said for how many of them have a persistent problem for years and years. I imagine that we would expect that they would recover from that use the same way as somebody who was using illegal opioids might without any intervention.
And that being said, though, like Dr. Brownie and I both, I think, would endorse the idea that we do need to limit exposure for people that aren't using opioids. Like, obviously, no one's saying everyone needs opioids. Like, certainly we need judicious prescribing. We were liberally prescribing them. That led to a lot of diversion that caused some of sort of the kindling that started the overdose epidemic. But the match has always and is fentanyl and the fundamental transformation of the illegal market. That's what took us from 100 deaths, around 100 deaths per year in Alberta, to now over 1,200.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. I only have one question after the excellent testimony and thoughtful questions of my colleagues here. For Dr. Hishka and or Dr. Virani or both of you, Dr. Silverstone's suggestion at the beginning that we make clear that we're talking about under medical supervision for the essentially managed consumption, consistent, I think, with what we heard is the practice for alcohol at Ambrose, for example, but for other substances, controlled substances. Would you support that change, or do you have any sort of further commentary or nuance on that point?
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that from a policy perspective. It's essentially redundant language. In Canada, psychoactive substances are controlled substances, and they can only be prescribed and dispensed currently under medical supervision. So whether that be a physician or in BC, we have registered psychiatric nurses, for example. And actually in Alberta, we have nurse practitioners that can prescribe buprenorphine. So we already have, it's legally mandated that those drugs are only dispensed under medical supervision. So to add that clause to the motion would essentially be redundant and not recognize that fact. I fully appreciate Dr. Silverstone's point, and I think obviously having connections to medical professionals is important as part of these programs, but I just don't think the language is necessary.
Because from a regulatory standpoint, that's already provided for. is your
Exactly, and it is important in implementing these programs to work closely with the regulatory colleges in each provincial jurisdiction. So that's the CPSA here, as well as the college that regulates the pharmacists.
Dr.
Yeah,
Brown?
I would agree with that. That the language would be redundant because there's no other way to get people pharmaceutical grade opioids. But I would just challenge the paradigm that there's something magical about physicians prescribing psychoactive substances, and that the lines between drugs on certain schedules and drugs on other schedules of drugs is rooted in science. It's really, the more that I do this, the longer that I do this, the more that I realize those lines are very artificial. That doctors prescribing drugs can cause problems, and people who take drugs that aren't prescribed may not ever have any problems with them. And similarly, cannabis, for example, is on Schedule 1 still in the United States, and there's no scientific basis for that at all. So I would just challenge that paradigm that there's some rhyme or reason to how we've approached certain classes of drugs and how you get those classes of drugs and their relationship to potential harm.
Well, and I think that point is very well taken in the context of the history of the opioid epidemic, who we may never know who patient zero was, but it was probably a prescription and not, a street transaction, or at least an abundance of prescriptions that led to this situation. That said, and you can respond in a moment, is there any harm in adding under medical supervision if that is the regulatory standard? Because I think the other place that Dr. Silverstone's coming from is reassuring the public again around the fear that it's a sort of mass distribution as opposed to very much in a public health and therapeutic kind of context that supply would be administered.
Mayor Allison, I think that's a political question and not a science question.
Welcome to it. It is. Okay, fair enough. Well, now is your chance to have input into the political process, because this is partly about how we educate the public about what it is that we're really talking about here, and in plain language. But Dr. Virani, I think you had a reaction to maybe my earlier comment, and I'm happy to take your thoughts on this point as well.
Yeah, I imagine it would smooth some bumps out if, for better or for worse, you add a doctor to the equation. But I would say that, Donald made a really good point, as he always does, that I don't think it's a matter of patient zero. I think it's a matter of policy zero. And had we not had such an archaic and draconian approach to drugs, we would not be in this situation. And I don't just think that our drug policy is dated. There has never been a time when it's worked. And it's not because drugs have changed. It's because people have, for millennia, we know that there's historical evidence that people have always used psychoactive substances. As much as it would be great business for me as an addiction specialist to think that all drug use is problematic, it's just simply untrue. And our policies have resulted in harm more so than the drugs themselves.
Well, and I think the testimony from the purveyors of legal controlled substances who joined us today spoke to that really well too. So I've learned so much this morning. I thank you to all of our presenters for your very thoughtful comments and answers to the questions. I see no further questions at this time from members of the committee. So you can feel free to stay on and observe what comes next, but we'll ask you to remain muted from here on. So now I'll go back to Councillor McKean to see if you've got any more technical questions or process questions, or if you want to defer to others for questions of you on the motion.
I have one question for Mr. Corbould.
Go ahead.
The addition that I made today about reaching out to the province in regards to our 5 coming supportive housing facilities and seeing if we could do further negotiations around their description, their use of term therapeutic communities and see if we might get somewhere. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it on the record anyways. Are you happy to undertake that work with meeting with the government of Alberta and seeing if we can get somewhere?
Yes, certainly happy to do that, Councillor McKean. I think it's well worth having that discussion, regardless of the outcome. I, want a better outcome, but we have to have the discussion. We have no problem taking that forward.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I have no other questions. I'm available to answer questions if committee has it, though.
Okay, maybe I'll hop on then and just ask, you heard the questions I was just asking and Mr. Silverstone's suggestion, and I saw your head nodding at the notion of plain language and demystifying a little bit what this is, notwithstanding the regulatory requirements that Dr. Hishka clarified. Your thoughts on Dr. Silverstone's suggested adjustment to add to just make explicit what is required, which would be under medical supervision in the context of the therapeutic communities at any rate.
I thought it was a good suggestion, and I take Dr. Hishka and Dr. Barani's point on it. But I think in part here, we have some work to do on this issue with the public. And I think that offers a bit more assurance that we're working within the medical system. And so I would take that as absolutely friendly.
Okay, then let's make that change as suggested. And that was the only question I had arising from the commentary. I think that I will maybe then speak to it, but let me just loop around and see if there are others wishing to ask any further questions. I mean, actually, maybe I'll ask a follow-up question to Mr. Corbould. I know that Government of Alberta has been stressing a full spectrum approach to mental health and addiction supports, including residential treatment or so-called therapeutic communities, as a response to the challenge here. And so so I think Councillor McKean has asked the question, but I guess, would you see that as linked into the addictions? And you happen to have worked over there not that long ago, so you'll have heard some of those conversations, and not asking you to breach cabinet confidentiality or anything, but do you think there's compatibility in what some of their policy objectives are and some of what's being discussed here at a high level?
Yes, I certainly do, Your Worship, and the compatibility comes in the outcomes. I think everybody wants to achieve the same outcomes here, and I think it's always good to talk about different approaches to achieving those outcomes, and I think based on what we heard today, there's lots to present and discuss with the province, so yes.
Excellent, okay. Okay, those are all the questions I have at this time. Councillor Walters?
I was just going to speak to it when appropriate.
Go ahead.
Thanks, and I just, I do want to thank everybody who came today. Like you, Don, you learn so much from these folks that come and speak to us about this. So I am really grateful to all of you for your work, your commitment to this, your knowledge about this, and it is really helpful as an elected official who's largely a generalist at most in most of these areas, to hear from you all. So I do want to express that appreciation, and also to Councillor McKean, who has been such a steady and solid proponent of what's best for people's ability to heal in our city. We talk about homelessness and all the challenges associated with it, and we talk about mental illness and all the challenges associated with it. And I think addiction is among the most complicated to address, and it certainly feeds all of those other circumstances that we're confronted with as a community and as a city government. So thank you to you for continuing to press this and push us forward to do the right thing by people as much as we can as a municipal government. Your leadership is is legendary on this, in fact. And, I just wanted to address this issue that I raised in the questions, that, this notion or this narrative that, we only care about harm reduction in this city and don't care about the sort of full spectrum approach to people becoming well. And, Dr. Hishka's answers to my question were so clear and profound to me that it's, we need as many approaches as we can put in place, because not everybody heals and recovers the same way. And ultimately it is about recovery. It is like all of us want people to, as much as possible, recover from the, these terrible lives that they're afflicted with, that are worsened by their addictions. I remember, 25 years ago now, or more even, when I worked at Bissell Center, one of my jobs there was to staff on Wednesday nights a healing circle that was run by a couple named Sam and Shirley Shirt. And it was all about recovery. It just wasn't about people getting together and figuring out how to continue to use drugs or to passively promote anything but recovery. It was all about healing and recovery for folks. And, that's what this city has been committed to, even going back way further than my memories allow me to. So I think that is the disposition of our council, of our community at large, is that, we want to do this scientifically and with, the best evidence and the best approaches. And those approaches, of course, are aided by all the people who came here today. And so, I'm very much in support of this motion, because the actions contained within it do help us build a community where people are able to heal. And so thanks to Councillor McKean for bringing it forward. I will definitely vote yes.
Thank you, Councillor Walters. Councillor Cartmel?
Thank you, Mayor Iveson. I just want to echo the comments that have been made by my council colleagues. I'm not as eloquent as they are, so I repeat their words. First of all, I want to congratulate and thank Councillor McKean for bringing this forward and for his efforts on this. This has been a very informative conversation this morning, and as Councillor Walters mentioned, we are usually generalists at best, and it's hard to consume all of the information that has been offered, and it's harder still then to take that information and convey it to the people we represent, and to present it in a thoughtful and consumable way that generates support for these notions. Too often it's just a headline or just a paragraph. And so while I appreciate the comments of Dr. Virani and Dr. Hishka about, the regulations in place, I think it is important to continue to use some plain language, even if it is redundant, just to offer that to the people we represent, that it's just what it is we're talking about in some of the motions that we pass. This is a really rich conversation. It's contains some really compelling individual experiences. And they're heartrending, they're heartbreaking. It's hard to hear. And I think that most of the people we talk to and we represent, if they heard those stories, if they had the opportunity to consume them, would endorse what we're trying to do unconditionally. Unfortunately, it's when it's conveyed as a group or a policy or a marketplace or an ecosystem that we begin to lose that personal touch, and that it becomes more difficult for some of the public to really consume and understand and endorse. So I really, again, thank those that have come and share those experiences. They're compelling, they're touching, they're difficult to hear. But I just wanted to take that opportunity to make sure that people knew that they were heard, and that this is really important work, and that I support this wholeheartedly and unconditionally. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Banga?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. thanks to all the speakers who came out today. Some with passionate pleas, some with expert advice, and also some with their knowledge of the field. And whether we like it or not, it's pretty hard to say, but we all have in our daily contacts either lost or see somebody suffering from these consequences of drugs. Again, I know that a lot has been said by my council colleagues before, and it's great to see this initiative being brought forward by Councillor McKean. I know I don't have any voting capacity today, but when it comes to the council, and I will be in full support of it. And this is again great, and it's hard to realize without listening to all these folks about the enormity of this this subject. However, when you listen and talk to these folks and the people with their own experiences and people who lost loved ones in their life to these incidents, it really hits home. Without saying too much, I again say that I will be in full support of this when it comes before the council. And thanks a lot, Councillor McKean and everybody else that is going to support it. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Paquette?
Oh, thank you. With an eye to the clock, I'll be brief. I just want to thank everyone for coming out to speak today. So important, so essential, and we could have these conversations for a long time. They're much needed. I just want to echo some of the concern that was raised by some of my colleagues about the politicization of suffering and the politicization and ideological stances behind what is really an issue that is proven time and again with facts and data. We hear people talking about, and waxing rhapsodic about how for some folks there may be a special place in hell for this or that or the other. Well, folks who are mired in addiction are already in hell. And people who are trying to get them out understand this. It is a complex issue. There is no one right answer. And there is no magic wand that fixes it. It is a multi-pronged effort, and an effort that sometimes fails. Addiction doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of mental illness. It comes out of pain. It comes out of trauma. It comes out of a society turning a blind eye and politics turning a blind eye to the needs of people who are in crisis, or that allows people to fall into crisis. The numbers never add up when it comes to not helping people. The numbers always agree that when we help people, we do better statistically, we do better economically, we do better fiscally, and we do far better as a society. It may come as no surprise that in my extended family and in our experience, being the inheritors of generational trauma and the impacts, the incredibly complex and difficult to describe impacts that that can have, that in our family we have lost people to addiction. That in our family we currently have people who are in addiction. And these people are human beings. They are someone's child, someone's father, someone's brother or sister, aunt, uncle, cousin. And I cannot relay the level of disgust I have for those who mock concern while undermining efforts such as these. And my prayer is that their hearts are softened. And if their hearts cannot be softened, that the public holds them accountable. So while I cannot vote, I am absolutely in favor of this. And I thank Councillor McKean for bringing it forward. And I thank committee for making space for this incredibly important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Paquette. I'm just going to ask indulgence for us to extend because I've got a few things to say, and then Councillor McKean will get to close and we'll have the vote. So we may go a few minutes over unless there's an objection. Okay.
I don't object, I just can't stay. So
okay.
I want us to vote for this, but I have a hard stop at 12.
Okay, understood. I will speak very briefly then and give Councillor McKean the close. I want to thank Councillor McKean for bringing this forward. I think it's part of the full spectrum conversation that we've had. I think I really appreciated all of the commentary today. Dave Ward's testimony about when this works well, it saves lives and routes people to recovery. And when it doesn't, lives are lost. And that came to us time and time again today. And I was very moved today by many of the stories. And it must be hard for people to come and share those with us, but it does make a difference. And I hope many people listening are, and I expect many people listening are similarly moved. To Lindsay, thank you. I feel called in. We are often called out, and it is nice to be called in to embrace empathy and suspend judgment. And I think that makes it easier for all of us to hear that clearly the evidence, and thank you to our experts and those who've done, as citizens, extensive research in this, that treatment is the answer, and treatment takes many forms, including ensuring that people who have an active dependency have access to something safe as opposed to something that will kill them, that they need to engage in desperate acts to attain from people of often dubious character in desperate circumstances where their dependency is leading to their victimization. And in turn, that the criminalization of that dependency and that victimization is actually making the problem worse. And that as a result, really clearly, I think the understanding here that I had instinctively before, but feel so much better equipped to argue for today now after this conversation, is that what we are doing as a society simply isn't working. It wasn't working before fentanyl began to pollute and poison the drug supply. It wasn't working before the economic downturn in Alberta that's led to a higher incidence of unemployment and mental health, violence, and substance use dependency. And it wasn't working before COVID-19, which has made all of this so much worse. And so here we are with an opportunity to join many other Canadian local governments to ask for partnership and leadership from senior orders of government having primary jurisdiction over these issues to deal better with untreated substance dependency with treatment, because it being untreated effectively today is driving crime. It's a huge burden on our streets and on our first responders and our communities, and it is costing lives that could be saved. So clearly I'll support the motion. Councillor McKean, I didn't leave you much time, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will regret it if my friend Sarah Hamilton can't vote on this, but this is a recommendation up to council, so she will have an opportunity if she has to go. And I apologize, Sarah, if I cut into your time when you have to go for your next meeting. I want to thank people, all the people who showed up today, for your contributions, your submissions, people who have committed their lives to the study of this, and people whose lives were deeply impacted with the grief of a lost friend or loved one. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to speak a little bit for those who didn't show up today. People who would be in opposition. People who are fearful about drugs and drug use. And I completely understand that. They don't want their children to use drugs. They don't want their friends and families to get pulled into addiction. And nobody wants that for a loved one. But these are powerful substances that, as Dr. Barani said, have been used for millennia by human beings. And yet, in some cases, some minority that Dr. Hishka talked about, they have extra power. And if any of you read the blog post I wrote at scottmckean.ca, little shameless self-promotion there, I talked about my bias. And my bias is built on my own recovery. And having attended hundreds of 12-step meetings and meeting the most wonderful, sensitive, funny people who were crazed, maybe even dangerous. No, and some of them were dangerous when they were in the throes of their addiction. So people with addictions, I've learned firsthand, are not monsters. But we have portrayed them that way, and with various other descriptors over the years. And I think that's not only false, it's unfair, and it deters us from good health and social policy, as we've heard today here. You know, I'm really glad that Councillor Banga joined us today as an ex-police officer. We have, unfortunately, handed this issue to the criminal justice system, which is ill-equipped to deal with what is really an illness and a healthcare issue. And the more that we can shift this into the compassionate care of doctors and nurses and others in the healthcare system, the better off everybody is going to be. But we have to also reduce the shame and stigma. It's one of the things that still troubles me even about this motion is that, you know, a majority of the overdoses are happening out in or are happening in people's homes. So how do we invite them out to go get help if they need it, to make sure that they don't die alone in their bedroom or living room? That's haunting me a little bit, that we're maybe not getting at that issue here. But I'm hoping the federal response will include a really good campaign of education and information about the true nature of addiction, that it's not a moral failing, that these people are not monsters, as I said. I'm really, really touched by the commentary today from our speakers and from my colleagues on council. And this is another small step towards a better future, I think, for not just for individuals, but for the communities that suffer the side effects of the social disorder and the crime and the grief that has come from this horrific shadow pandemic. So it looks like this is going to pass and be recommended up to council. I'm deeply moved by that and thrilled by that. So thank you, all of you, very, very much. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Please vote.
And Councillor Walters, I can see that you're in the correct meeting, but your vote doesn't seem to be coming through.
My vote was submitted as yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Mayor, it appears that Councillor Hamilton did drop off the call, so assuming that she's absent, we have 4 votes.
Well, she'll get a shot at council shortly, so please display the vote. Unanimous among those able to stay on. That's carried. Thanks for your leadership, Councillor McKean. And it's a great piece if you haven't read it on his blog, scottmckean.ca. So, are there any notices of motion today? Not seeing any, then Executive Committee is adjourned. Apologies that we're a few minutes over. Thank you all.